Okay, so you're here because you want to get a handle on Generation Z, right? How they're dealing with this always-on digital world,
Yeah, what's happening with their well-being, their mental health.
and how spirituality fits into that picture. You want the key stuff, but, quickly without getting totally bogged down. So let's dive in.
Right. And for this deep dive, we've gathered some really interesting material. We have a big research review from PMC, which really zeroes in on digital stuff for spiritual and mental health in Gen Z.
Okay.
And then we've got articles from places like Therapy Group of NYC, Pacific Oaks, Therapy Treatment Team. They all offer slightly different takes on Gen Z, tech, mental health, and how we can maybe understand them better.
Exactly. So our mission really is to cut through all that and pull out the most important bits about where their digital life, spirituality, and mental health kind of meet.
What do we actually know? Where are the gaps?
Yeah, and what can you take away that's actually useful, something to chew on? Okay, so first things first, Gen Z. Who exactly are we talking about here, age-wise?
Generally, the sources hover around the mid-90s to early 2010s. That PMC review, for instance, uses 1995 to 2012. They point out that's roughly when the internet became, a public thing.
Right.
Another source starts a bit later, 97 to 2012. But the key thing, the consistent part, is they're the first true digital natives.
Digital natives. Grew up with it always there, and the numbers really show that, don't they?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The PMC review mentions, 95% have a smartphone?
95%.
And over half are online 4 hours or more every day.
Wow. Compared to, what was it, only about 28% of all U.S. adults?
Exactly. It's their default environment.
Yeah. And the sources seem to connect this constant online presence to some challenges they're facing.
They do. There's talk of higher reported rates of depression, ADHD, even tech addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And one article mentioned that Gen Z high schoolers back in the 2010s spent like an hour less each day hanging out with friends in person compared to millennials back in the early 2000s.
An hour less. That's a significant shift in how they connect. Less FaceTime, more screen time.
Yeah.
You can see how that might ripple outwards. So speaking of effects, let's dig into the mental health picture for Gen Z. It sounds like it's pretty complex.
It really is. The American Psychological Association Therapy Group of NYC mentioned this, found Gen Z reports more anxiety and depression than older generations.
Pacific Oaks said something similar, right? That they seem to be experiencing the most depression and anxiety compared generationally?
Yes, exactly. And the numbers are quite stark. Pacific Oaks flags that 42% of Gen Z say they deal with depression and hopelessness.
42%. That's nearly double the rate for people over 25.
It is. And for anxiety, something like 61% have apparently had a medical diagnosis for an anxiety condition.
At 1%, that's huge.
Therapy Group of NYC also brought up a 2018 survey. Only 45% of Gen Z rated their mental health as good or very good.
Less than half.
And a massive 91% said they'd experienced stress-related symptoms, physical or emotional, in the past year. It paints a picture of a generation under, significant strain.
Yeah. And what kind of things are causing this anxiety? What are the specific pressures?
It's a mix. Worries about the future, money, jobs, social stuff, relationships. It sounds like a lot coming at them at once.
An imperfect storm.
And then you layer on massive global events like the pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. COVID must have hit them hard.
Therapy Group of NYC really highlighted that. A worrying number reported thoughts of self-harm during that time, other negative mental health effects. Plus, there's this backdrop of ongoing stress, things like climate change, the political situation, school shootings. These aren't just blips, they're constant worries.
Right, and it's not just the big external stuff, is it? The digital world itself seems to play a part.
Yeah, Therapy Group of NYC mentioned this idea of technological isolation. Maybe loneliness despite being connected, a lack of deeper face-to-face connection.
And the comparison trap. Therapy Treatment Team mentioned that, didn't they? Seeing everyone's perfect life online.
Exactly. That constant comparison, it can really chip away at your self-esteem. It's a tough space to navigate constantly.
Definitely.
And we should also remember the context. Therapy Group of NYC noted that sometimes older generations paint Gen Z negatively, which just adds pressure.
Invalidates their struggles, yeah.
And, crucially, there are racial disparities. People of color in Gen Z often face extra layers of stress and trauma from systemic issues.
It's a really tangled web of pressures. But there's a positive side here, too, isn't there? They seem much more open about mental health.
That's a really key difference, yeah. Both Therapy Group of NYC and Pacific Oaks stress this. They're more willing to talk about it, to seek help.
They'll actually say, I'm struggling.
Yes, and share it sometimes, even on social media. And they actively look for therapy. Pacific Oaks said something like 2 out of 5 Gen Z surveyed are in therapy regularly. And over half have used professional mental health services at some point. They're really working to break down that stigma.
So facing big challenges, but also being pretty proactive.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Spirituality, how does that figure into the Gen Z experience?
Well, the PMC review draws a helpful line between religion and spirituality. Religion being more the organized systems, beliefs,
Yeah.
higher power focus,
Right, the traditional structures.
whereas spirituality is broader. It's more about a personal search for connection to yourself, others, nature, or something sacred or transcendent.
And Gen Z leans more towards the spiritual side, perhaps less towards organized religion.
That's what the research suggests. The PMC review cited one study where 77% consider themselves spiritual,
77%.
but slightly fewer, 68% identified as religious. And they seem to define spirituality on their own terms. Autonomous, unbundled faith was a phrase used, and inclusive. It's very individualistic.
Interesting. And does this spirituality connect to their mental health? Is there a link?
Apparently, yes. The PMC review pointed to research linking greater spirituality with lower depression rates, fewer suicidal thoughts, less substance abuse.
So it acts like a buffer, maybe?
It seems like it could be a protective factor, yeah. And many Gen Z individuals themselves feel their spiritual connection helps their mental well-being.
That sense of purpose, meaning connection, you can see how that could be a really valuable resource for coping with everything else.
Absolutely.
Which brings us right to a really critical point. How do digital tools fit in here? Can tech support both their spiritual and mental health? The PMC review really dug into this, didn't it? And it sounds like, well, we don't know much.
That's basically the headline finding from that review. They really stress how little research there is, looking specifically at digital methods that combine both spiritual and mental health support for Gen Z.
So not just mental health apps or just spiritual apps, but things that integrate the two.
Exactly. And they said before their review, there were basically no systematic overviews of this specific intersection. We're kind of in uncharted territory.
And when they looked for studies, they didn't find many.
Hardly any. They started with over 800 potential articles and ended up with just 5 that met their exact criteria.
5 out of 800. That really does highlight the gap.
It really does. And those 5 were from different countries, used different methods. But the key thing, only 2 actually tested a digital intervention aiming at both spiritual and mental health.
Okay, tell us about those 2. What did they find?
So one was called the Bravest Study. It was in the U.S. with Native American and Alaska Native youth. They used text messages to send out wellness strategies.
Okay, texts. Interesting.
Yeah. And they found that perceived overall health, physical, mental, spiritual combined, actually increased over time in both the group getting the texts and the control group.
Both groups. So the text didn't make a unique difference.
Not a statistically significant one, no. And the researchers admitted that combining all 3 health aspects into one measure made it hard to see the specific impact on, say, just spiritual health.
Right, hard to tease apart. What was the other study?
That one was in Canada, looking at an app called Joy Pop, designed for Indigenous youth. It was more about feasibility. Could this work? The results on mental wellness ratings were kind of mixed, but the youth gave good feedback on the app itself, its features, and importantly, how to make it more culturally relevant for them.
So maybe some potential, but needing refinement. And the review mentioned other studies too, but they weren't quite hitting that sweet spot of digital, spiritual, and mental health together.
Right. Like one in South Africa looked at interest in a mental health app. Interest was high, but they flagged potential cultural or religious clashes with using an app for that.
Yeah, that thanks.
Another in China looked at religion and mental health in college students, but most didn't have a religion anyway. And a big issue across the board, the review noted, was a lack of consistency. How are they even defining spiritual health or mental health? It wasn't standardized.
So it's all a bit fuzzy. We know they're online. We know they face mental health issues. We know many are spiritual. But how tech can help bridge spirituality and mental health is still a big question mark.
A very big question mark.
Yeah.
And the PMC review really hammers home these gaps.
What are the main ones they highlighted?
Well, first, just the sheer lack of published research focusing specifically on Gen Z's spiritual and mental health together. A lot of what exists on their spirituality is from like faith groups or isn't peer-reviewed academic work.
And it often just compares them to older generations.
Right. Rather than really exploring their practices, their preferences, how it links to their health.
So we need more deep dives into their actual experiences.
Exactly. More empirical work. And a huge limitation they pointed out was the lack of validated measures,
Meaning?
meaning they weren't using standardized, reliable tools or questionnaires to assess mental health or spirituality.
Yeah.
And often, spiritual health itself wasn't even clearly defined in the study.
It sounds like there's a massive opportunity for researchers here. But even with these gaps, did the review offer any hints about how digital tools could be used effectively?
It did offer some suggestions, yeah. Based on the fact that Gen Z is so comfortable online, open about mental health, and many feel spirituality helps their mental state.
Digital tools seem like a natural fit, potentially.
Potentially, yes. The BRAVE study, even with its limits, showed delivering wellness tips via text did see some improvement in perceived health.
Okay.
And maybe even social media, despite all its downsides, could be used. The South African study hinted it might help increase awareness about mental health resources.
Using the platforms they're already on.
And the idea of a specific spiritual self-care app came up, tailored for Gen Z, giving them that autonomy and convenience they seem to value.
But it would need to be relevant to them, right?
Absolutely crucial. Incorporating things like cultural relevance, inclusivity, social justice, nature, things the Canadian and U.S. studies flagged as important.
And the customization potential of apps seems to fit with their individualistic approach to spirituality.
It does. But of course, there are challenges and things to watch out for.
Definitely. What are some of the big hurdles or concerns?
Well, that point from the South African study, potential clashes between digital platforms and religious or cultural beliefs, that's real.
Yeah, can't ignore that.
And just the general downsides of being always on. The comparison culture that therapy treatment team in Pacific Oaks mentioned, that takes mental toll.
And therapy treatment team also mentioned the paradox of choice, didn't they? Too much information, too many options online, leading to paralysis.
Exactly, overwhelm.
Yeah.
And this constant connection can lead to burnout, maybe even less creativity or empathy.
Overstimulation, trouble focusing.
Right. Screen addiction is a real concern too, impacting sleep, relationships, schoolwork, and of course, cyberbullying is a major issue that hits well-being hard.
It's definitely not a simple picture. And even with more openness, that stigma around mental health still lingers, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, yes, in many places.
Now, for you listening, maybe you're a parent, a mentor, someone working with Gen Z therapy treatment team, had some practical advice on support, right?
Yes, some really good points, like fostering a growth mindset, helping them see challenges as opportunities to learn.
Helping them break big decisions down into smaller steps.
Yeah, making things feel less overwhelming. And, really importantly, having open conversations about their digital lives. Not just banning tech, but understanding their world.
Which makes sense. You can't just ignore it. Modeling healthy tech boundaries yourself.
Crucial. Also, encouraging them to explore things without pressure. Validating how they feel, helping them build real-world life skills.
And knowing when to connect them with other support, like mentors or counseling.
Exactly. All really important support strategies.
So as we kind of wrap this up, what's the main takeaway? What's the big insight here?
For me, it's this striking gap. You've got this generation so immersed in digital life, facing really significant mental health challenges, and often identifying as spiritual.
But there's almost no solid research on how digital tools can actually help connect that spirituality with their mental health needs in an effective, integrated way.
It feels like a huge blind spot, both in understanding and in how we offer support.
Yeah. Which really leaves us with a question for you to think about. Given how digitally fluent Gen Z is and how open they are becoming about mental health, what kind of innovative digital tools could bridge that gap?
What could personalized, culturally sensitive tech do to actually nurture their spiritual and mental well-being in this, very digital age?
It definitely makes you think about the future of mental health support. Maybe check out some of the apps we mentioned, Headspace, Calm, BetterHelp, or even look at the mental health conversations happening on TikTok, see what's out there.
And maybe just reflect on your own balance.
Yeah.
Digital connection versus face-to-face time and how that plays out for you and the people around you.